everyone. I'm Dr. Chana Davis. I'm a geneticist, a science communicator, and a mom of 3 kids. I'm really excited to be bringing you a 2-for-1 session today. Since it's almost Thanksgiving in the US, we thought it would be useful to talk about staying safe during the triple threat holiday season. And given all the family gatherings coming up, we thought it'd be fun to discuss science denial and how to talk with people who don't follow the science the way that you probably do yourself. So my guest today is Dr. Sara Gorman. She's a fellow nerdy girl and is super passionate about fighting science denial and understanding the forces that determine science denial. So Sara, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I have a background in the intersection of psychology and public health, and I've really focused on the psychological and social factors that are behind science denial and acceptance of misinformation about health and science. My book about this, Denying to the Grave, really looked at these psychological and social factors, and it came out in an updated version in 2021. And I'm actually working on a new book now on conspiracy theories and medical mistrust, which should be out in 2024. And I also founded an organization called Critica, which is focused on combating misinformation online mostly, as well as making sure people can make informed health and scientific-based decisions.
Well, I'm thrilled to have your expertise at the table today, as I'm sure that many of us will be sitting across from somebody who maybe falls into that camp. I would appreciate tools for talking to them in a respectful, productive way.
Absolutely. It's so important this time of year. I get many questions about what to do during Thanksgiving.
Yes, yes. But as I mentioned, we're going to be having kind of a 2-for-1 conversation because we also want to really talk about, what's the urgent situation upon us with regards to the triple threat, respiratory viruses, and how we can make sure we stay safe. So I just thought actually maybe I should set the stage with defining the term triple threat since we're using that today. So that refers to the fact that we're having a bad flu and RSV season that are surging high and surging early. So things are not looking very good combined with COVID. So this is really hitting hospitals hard, especially young children and babies. And of course, it's not just the hospitals being hit, it's the families being hit, it's the healthcare workers. It's a huge strain on so many of us. So we want to talk today about doing our part to keep ourselves and others safe. And I won't get into too much detail on what's actually going on here, but I'm going to copy a link here to, let me just get this. We have a great link to an article that our editor-in-chief wrote about this term immunity debt and a little bit about the situation with the triple threat and what's going on. So I recommend checking out the post on immunity debt that I've just posted there. That gives a bit more depth on what's actually going on and why are we seeing this bad surge in respiratory viruses right now. So with that kind of background on triple threat, let's talk about one of the threats right now, RSV. So Sara, can you tell us what is RSV, who's at highest risk, and a bit high level on what we can do to minimize the toll of RSV?
Sure. So RSV is actually a common respiratory infection. It's one of the many causes of what we think of as the common cold. And most children will have had RSV by the time they're 2 and not have had a serious case. It presents like a cold-like illness with sneezing and fever and fatigue, usually, and runny nose, things like that. It can be dangerous especially in preterm babies, infants under the age of 6 months, and any children who have some underlying health conditions like heart and lung diseases. And so we have to be especially careful with those populations, especially now when, as Chana said, the hospitals are very overwhelmed. And it can also be an issue in older adults, so over the age of 65. And the same thing is with young children. Any adults who have chronic lung or heart conditions are at greater risk of severe disease. So you'll see, like I said, some of those cold symptoms and fever coming up. In very young babies, there can be very subtle symptoms only, like just lethargy and irritability. And you should always be careful with young babies around breathing and making sure they're not breathing with difficulty, and not spiking a fever under 3 months of age is a medical emergency.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the older adults because there are going to be many different multi-generational gatherings happening over the holidays, and something that's not serious to you is very serious to someone else, and so I think we all need to do our part there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a few follow-up questions for you, Chana.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in terms of protecting ourselves during the Thanksgiving season, what can we do to make our gatherings safe from this triple threat?
Well, I think it breaks down to two big categories having a safe gathering. The first is who's there, and are we minimizing the chances that somebody who's contagious is at the gathering? And then the second aspect is what are we doing at the gathering to minimize the spread if somebody contagious is there and maybe they didn't know it. So, with regards to the first aspect of that, how do we minimize the number of sick people that are there with any of these respiratory viruses? Some of it's very obvious. Stay home if sick, although sick is a bit of a fuzzy term, which maybe we can talk about a bit more. But staying home if you're sick, and also staying home, especially with COVID, we know that you can still be contagious even after your symptoms are better. In fact, the viral load can go up. A lot of people don't actually test positive until a few days after their symptoms peak and are even resolving. So staying home if you're feeling like you're on the cusp of getting sick, because there can be a lot of spread when you're pre-symptomatic or just at that tipping point, when you're very obviously sick, and when you're recently sick. Although I don't actually know the specific infectious contagious windows for all the respiratory viruses. I do know for COVID that it can extend into when you're starting to feel better. So the sickness, and then of course there's rapid testing, which I'm a huge proponent of. And I understand there's a lot of variability in access, but here in BC, where I'm in Vancouver, Canada, I can actually get free rapid test, a box of 5 at the pharmacy 2 blocks away. So I use them very liberally whenever my kids have any cold-like symptoms. So that is a great layer of protection. It's certainly not going to catch every case, especially every asymptomatic case. But if you test maybe the day before and at the event, you've really you'll catch some cases that might have otherwise slipped through into your gathering. So that's the keeping sick people away part, or keeping contagious people away, which is actually what really matters. And then there's the reducing transmission at the event, and it's the strategies that a lot of the same strategies work across different respiratory viruses. I mean, some of them are a little more droplet based, and so the hand washing and the surfaces are more important, and others are more the breathing based. So you want to do both. You want to do the hand washing, be aware of just sanitary surfaces, but the airflow is only going to help you if you can, just depending on where you are weather-wise, being conscious of maximizing airflow. Masking is not something many of us are going to want to do at Thanksgiving or at a family gathering, but if there are vulnerable people there, it's a layer that you can use. Or if you're maybe on the tipping point of I think I might be sick, but I'm not sure, it's just another layer that you can use. So it's really up to you how many layers you want to deploy, but there's a lot of different options that you have at your disposal. And just kind of figure out the strategy that works for not only your comfort level, but the comfort level of everybody at the gathering and the vulnerability level of everybody at the gathering.
That's great. That's really helpful. And I think there's a couple of important things to draw out there, which are thinking about being sick and being contagious are not necessarily the same thing. So you can be those time periods before, and as you said, after you're starting to feel better, you can still be contagious. That's why we have extra measures in place like air circulation and masking in certain cases, because sometimes people don't even know they're sick yet. And then I did mean to also say that surfaces are important for RSV and for flu. So it's good to, even though maybe less so for COVID, it's good to still keep those surfaces clean, and wash your hands a lot and avoid touching your face.
Yeah, I've dropped in a link to a post that we had on what is RSV, that can help give some background there, and another one on how do you know which one you have, what are the differences. So I recommend checking both of those out. And I guess the key takeaway on which one do I have is it's kind of a process of elimination, because we do have home tests if available to you for COVID. And so if you can test multiple times and rule out COVID, then it's probably one of the other ones. And we don't have home tests, unfortunately, to really make a clear diagnosis at this point. Although many of the precautions are the same anyways.
Yeah, take all the precautions if you don't know what you have. I have a follow-up question for you, Chana, about being sick, since we talked about what to do if you're sick and how to, stay home or, isolate yourself. So how sick is too sick to go to Thanksgiving this year?
That is a really, really hard question. It's going to depend on who's there, right? If it's a bunch of young, healthy adults, I think, being sick is not fun, but it's a very different consequence of getting someone sick if they're have a strong immune system versus if they're a baby or an older adult or have some vulnerability. So I think we really need to be respectful of other people's health conditions. So I'll just tell you for my family, I would say I would be comfortable with even having my mom around if my kids have maybe sniffles or a sore throat, but only if they've had a negative COVID test. If I didn't have my mom there, and I would probably have a lower bar, and the testing part maybe wouldn't be as important. Even if you think back to the pre-COVID era, what did we do? I think I actually remember when my kid was in daycare in preschool for the first time and they had a runny nose. I said, is it okay to go with a runny nose or not? And they said, yes, it's okay, because if we said no, nobody would ever be there. So you have to kind of balance the practicalities with who's going to be there. And I think that's a reflection of why we've seen even the list of criteria for COVID in schools, the symptom list kept evolving, and runny nose was on the list, runny nose was off the list, because there is a balance between practicality and protection. But I think one thing that's consistent is always, like, fever is a red flag, and just I can't barely get out of bed is a red flag. There are certain red flags, but there's a lot of gray area.
I think many people probably share your pain about when to keep the kids home when they're sick in the
Absolutely.
COVID era. It's not an
Yeah.
easy decision. And I have the same rule about COVID testing if my parents or, the grandparents are going to be around, and
Yeah.
maybe not if not. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like, I mean, just right now is a good example for me. My son has a sore throat. He's tested negative for COVID twice, so I'm quite sure it's not COVID. But do I send him to school? I decided not to, just because he's pretty miserable. He's not enjoying. He's really hurts, and I just don't want to do that to someone else. And I have the flexibility to be able to stay home to allow that. So I think that's also for me something that's come out of COVID, is just greater awareness of the fact that transmission to others is not inevitable. So when my husband, for example, was sick about a month ago, he had symptoms on Sunday, very mild symptoms on Sunday. Monday, he felt really sick. And I thought, I'm staying away from you. I don't even care if you have COVID or not. Whatever you have, I don't want it. And so I slept in a different bedroom. I asked him to not come down. It ended up that he had COVID. It turned out Tuesday he tested positive. But, I think that's the right move regardless. Whatever he had was unpleasant. And I think pre-COVID, I probably would have just slept in the same room as him. It didn't really dawn on me how much control we have over transmission. It just sounds so
Yeah.
obvious now.
I mean, public health experts have always said to take these measures with any transmissible illness, but I think we just, still go to work and power through, and things spread a lot more easily. So I agree with you. That's
Yeah, there
important.
definitely has to be a cultural change to allow people to stay home when sick. And I'm sure I haven't really been in the public health field until COVID came along. And so I'm sure you've been yelling this for years now.
Yes, it's not new to us.
Yes.
So, what if I did have COVID and it's day 5? Now, is it safe to go to the family gathering?
Yeah. Personally, I would want to wait longer than day 5. I think this opens up a conversation about, public policy being a reflection of a balance of practicalities, and protection, right? So initially we were asked to quarantine for 10 days, because that's a period where within 10 days there's some chance of transmission. And we've since learned that the vast majority of transmission happens in the first 5 days. So it's really it's a risk tolerance thing, right? How comfortable are you with the idea that there's some chance that you could be spreading it? So not just you, but those that you're gathering with, right? So I think you just need to recognize that if it's after day 5, it doesn't mean you're in the clear. It just means that your chances of transmitting to others is much lower. If you have a negative antigen test and it's after day 5, then your chances of transmitting are really low. So I would personally probably feel comfortable after about day 7. If it was someone vulnerable, I would feel comfortable if it was after day 7 and a negative antigen test. But if I didn't have the negative antigen test, I would want to probably wait till day 10 to feel comfortable. And that's why the recommendations have been, isolate for day 5 and then masking to day 10, because we rarely see transmission after day 10. It's just a fuzzy period between day 5 and day 10. But the antigen tests help tell you whether you're in the lower or higher risk in that during that fuzzy period.
So the fuzzy period, I think, is maybe a good segue into our other topic here.
Absolutely.
Because of the way that we tend to answer questions in the health and science world, we can't tell you for sure when you won't be contagious anymore. So it's magically safe on day 8 for you to go to Thanksgiving. We can give you what we know.
Yeah.
Everything's kind of a percent risk calculation, and some of it is a personal decision, depending on who's there and what the circumstances are. So I think sometimes that's hard. That's hard for people to deal with, because it doesn't have the straight out, here are the facts, here's the recommendation, bundled up in there. So
Exactly. Yeah. So let's get into your area of expertise and the conspiracy theories and misinformation. So why do some people buy into these even when it's clear that it's harmful to them?
So there's a lot of literature on why and how people come to believe in conspiracy theories. And there's a lot of debate about whether there are more conspiracy theories roaming around now and more people who believe them, or whether it's still sort of the same amount of belief. But the bottom line is that there are a number of motivations that are really psychological and social. So there's an epistemic, what we call an epistemic motivation, which has to do with knowledge and has to do with trying to deal with uncertainty and get the answer about something when there isn't a good answer out there. There's a social aspect, which is that you might be part of a group or become part of a group by believing in a conspiracy theory, and then not believing in it anymore would be very difficult because you would be out of the group. And there's also a existential motive, which has to do with any time that somebody feels their identity is threatened, or they feel powerless in some way, like if they lost a job or they lost their earnings or something happened that made them feel like they don't have good control over their lives and their destiny, they are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. There's also some literature that suggests that higher levels of narcissism is also associated with belief in conspiracy theories. That's an interesting one. And then in terms of misinformation, there's a mixed literature about, are there certain types of people who fall for it more easily? We all fall for it to a certain extent. It's pretty universal that people will believe some kind of misinformation in their life. And we don't see a great connection between sort of education or socioeconomic status and belief in misinformation. We do see, though, that people over the age of 65 tend to share misinformation more. And in people who are not, I think the other one that's important is people who are not college educated does have some association with not believing in misinformation. But that's not always consistent. So, we're still, I think I would say we're still trying to figure out sort of what the parameters around that look like.
Yeah, I think it's really great that you point out that none of us are immune, because it's easy to sit on your high horse and think that everything that I believe is correct. It's really important, I think, to recognize, to try to see that in yourself.
Absolutely. And I try to always have stories. I have many in my book about ways that I, use a flawed reasoning or believe something that wasn't true. And because we all have biases. And the other thing I'll say is that people who have high anxiety, even if it's just about one specific topic, if they're looking at that topic, they're going to have more confirmation bias. So they're going to be looking for things that confirm what they believe, because they're very invested in not undermining it if they're anxious about it. So that is also a risk factor, just being sort of worked up about a certain topic.
Yeah, I think this is a whole other topic, but I've come to realize through COVID how much it's important to nip it in the bud, as you alluded to, that once the deeper you go, once it becomes part of your identity, the harder it is to go backwards.
Absolutely. I think some people who feel that they have a very multifaceted identity are maybe a little bit immune because they can see different sides of themselves. They don't have to adhere to a theory that's kind of holding their whole identity together. So the more people can sort of diversify their groups that they belong to, the better off they are.
Yeah, no, but I can imagine it'd be very hard to let go of something if that was your whole community believed that thing, and then you said I don't anymore. Then what's
Mhm.
your community, right?
Right, exactly. It's a very strong psychological force, that
Yeah.
social force.
So it ends up being a lot less about facts than we initially think it is.
Yeah, it's sometimes the actual content doesn't matter that much. And I'll give you an example. In some cases, people believe into conspiracy theories that can't really coexist. So they'll believe at the same time that Princess Diana was murdered and also that she's still alive and that it was staged. And so, most people say, well, how can you believe both those things at the same time? And what's going on there is that, and it's actually more common than you'd think that people do this. What's going on there is that people feel that something is fishy, that they have a suspicion, they think something's not right. And it almost doesn't matter what the actual conspiracy information is. They're looking for alternative explanations to sort of exercise and deal with the fact that they feel uncomfortable with the official explanation for whatever reason.
Wow, that is fascinating. I didn't realize that. That's
Yeah,
such a common phenomenon.
yeah, it is.
So what advice do you have for having productive conversations with conspiracy theorists and denialists?
So this is something I work on a lot at my organization, Critica. We've developed actually a protocol for having some of these conversations, and we train people to do these professionally as well. So there are some really important components that we like to talk about that really are there to help establish common ground with the person you're talking to, but also actually see if you can get out some of their ambivalence. Because a lot of people are not so extreme about what they believe, but they're actually just not sure. And they may be taken in a little bit by a conspiracy theory because they're feeling uncomfortable about the topic in some way, but they're not totally sold on it yet. And so you're catching a lot of people in that moment when they're on the fence. And so what you want to do is to first of all, thank them for sharing with you. Ask them questions. So get over your reflex to correct them immediately and start to ask them questions to help them draw out the process that they took to get to these ideas. Ask them about the kind of sources that they trust in general, and then ask if you can actually share information that some of which might come from some of those sources that they might use in general, not necessarily about this topic, but just sources that are reliable, that are things that they may read for other topics. And then, you just want to know that you're not going to necessarily change somebody's mind in one conversation. So it might be a few subsequent interactions you have to have, which is fine. It just takes some time, and you have to be okay leaving it in sort of an uncertain space for the time being. I would also say if you're dealing with somebody who's really, really hardcore, who's sort of a extremist, suss the situation out, but you may not want to engage in that conversation, and that's okay because it will be hard to change their mind. So in those cases, it's okay to say that this conversation is getting too out of hand and I don't want to proceed. But in those cases where people are on the fence, there's a lot you can do to, as I said, draw out the ambivalence and create a common ground, also by talking about what you understand to be the facts and how you got there, and maybe times that you struggled with the official account as well.
I'm really glad you talked about when it's okay to walk away because, you know, as you know, I'm sure COVID has strained so many relationships, and it's for those that are really trying to fight separation, it can be so exhausting to run up against it again and again and again. So, those speaking, speaking for science need to be mindful of their emotional mental health and being thoughtful when we want to actually engage and put that energy in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because it's something that's not talked about a lot, that you might not want to engage with some people, and some people may never change their minds. But if we shouldn't be spending all of our time and energy on the people who are at the extremes, because they're actually not most people. Most people, like I said, are more on the fence. The people who are on the extreme, and especially people who spread disinformation, which is like the purposeful sharing of incorrect information, should be, there should be regulation, there should be social media rules around what they can and can't do. That's sort of a different set of solutions. But in terms of really being able to talk to somebody who's an extremist, that may not be necessary.
So I'm going to drop in a link to a article written by Lindsay Lanier, who was the initial CEO of those nerdy girls. And so she wrote a concept of how to engage with COVID conspiracies. Clearly, you're on the same page. A lot of the intersect and finding common ground and listening. So there's a link that covers a lot of that material. We are just about out of time, so I'm going to drop in some links to your organization. And if you have any last comments or advice in the coverage that you wanted to throw in about these topics.
Okay, sure. Your audio is breaking up a little bit, but I think you're asking me if I have any last advice or thoughts on these topics. Okay. Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that some of these issues around conspiracy theories and medical mistrust that I'm working on and that come up in our day-to-day lives as well do have other causes that are sort of structural, like the healthcare system may contribute to people's mistrust, or some of what we noticed in COVID with the poor communication coming from government sources. So it's not all, I just want to make sure people understand it's not sort of all in anyone's head, that it's all just a psychological feature. There are real factors in the world around us that create situations that make the ground more fertile for some of this misinformation to spread and for people to not trust in the government and the health system. So just always keeping that in mind, because it helps to not sort of blame the victim, and not to think of people who may share misinformation as necessarily just being ill-informed or trying to stir the pot, but that there are a lot of complex structural issues that do make these problems more common.
Okay. Well, apparently my audio is pretty poor. I don't know if that reconnected anything, but I think I'll just wrap up here. Thank you for joining us, and please submit questions to the Dear Pandemic website. And we always review every question, and we use them to inform our conversation. So thank you for being here. If you can't hear me,
Can hear you.
and yeah, see you online. Take care.
Bye.